What if everything you believe about time is wrong? What if the universe never actually began? And the question you've been asking your whole life, where did everything come from, is not just unanswered, but unanswerable. Tonight, you're not going to get a simple explanation. You're going to feel something stranger. Because we're about to take two of the most powerful ways humans have ever tried to understand reality, modern science and early Buddhism, and place them side by side. Not to agree, not to argue, but to see what happens when both are pushed to their limits. Science tells you the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. Buddhism quietly replies, there is no true beginning. Science says time started with the Big Bang. Buddhism asks, what if beginning itself is an illusion? And somewhere between those two, a crack appears, a place where your usual way of thinking stops working. Now here's the unsettling part. This is not just about the universe. It's about you. Because the same thing that makes you ask what came before time is the same thing that creates your sense of past, present, and future, your mind. And once you see how that works, you won't be able to unsee it. This is not a podcast you just listen to. It's one you slowly fall into. A journey through time that may not exist, a universe that may not have a beginning, a self that may not be real in the way you think, and a question that quietly dissolves the deeper you look at it. So don't rush. Don't try to understand everything. Just listen. Let the ideas settle like ripples in still water. And somewhere along the way, you may notice something subtle. The universe didn't change, but the way you see it did. And before we begin, if you're curious about these kinds of deep, mind-bending journeys, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel. It helps this kind of content reach more people and keeps these explorations going. Now, let's begin. Part 1. The question that breaks the universe. There is a question so simple that almost everyone has asked it at least once. Where did the universe come from? And right behind it, another question, quieter but far more dangerous. What happened before time began? Tonight, we're not just going to explore those questions. We're going to take them apart, turn them inside out, and look at them from two very different directions. On one side, modern science, telescopes, equations, the Big Bang. On the other, early Buddhism. No creator, no beginning, only conditions, only causes, giving rise to more causes. At first glance, these two worlds seem completely different. One speaks in mathematics, the other in human experience. But here's the strange part. When you listen carefully, they don't just disagree. Sometimes they sound like they're pointing to the same thing, and sometimes they completely contradict each other. So tonight, we follow both paths, not to pick a side, but to see what happens when they collide. Now let's begin with something very familiar, the idea of a beginning. Every story you know has one. A movie begins, a life begins, a day begins. So naturally, you assume the universe must have one too. A first moment, a starting point, a frame number one. Science even gives it a name, the Big Bang. About 13.8 billion years ago, everything we can observe was compressed into an incredibly hot, dense state. Then it expanded. Space stretched, energy spread, and time began. Simple enough, but now slow down, because something inside that idea doesn't quite fit. Every beginning you've ever experienced happens inside time. A movie begins at a specific moment, but that moment already exists in time. So what would it even mean for time itself to begin? It's like asking, what is before the first second? The question sounds normal, until you realize it might not make sense at all. Now, here's where science becomes unexpectedly humble. When physicists push their equations back toward the Big Bang, they don't find a clear answer. They find a boundary, a place where time stops behaving like time, not slowing down, not reversing, just no longer applicable. So when you ask, what happened before the Big Bang, science quietly responds, that question might be invalid. Now pause, because that's already unsettling. But early Buddhism goes even further. It doesn't just say, we don't know. It suggests you're asking the wrong kind of question. In early Buddhist thought, there is no single starting point, no first cause, no absolute beginning. Instead, there is something called dependent origination. Everything arises because of conditions, not one cause, but many. A seed becomes a tree because of soil, water, sunlight. Remove the conditions, and the tree never appears. Now extend that idea. The universe itself is not created by something. It arises when conditions are present and disappears when conditions fall apart. No beginning, no end, only process. Now, here's where things get interesting. Science says the universe had a beginning. Buddhism says there is no true beginning. That sounds like a contradiction. But let's look closer. Science also says time itself began at the Big Bang, meaning there is no before. And Buddhism says there is no meaningful first cause. So both, in their own way, are telling you something uncomfortable. The idea of a clean beginning may be an illusion. Now let's flip the perspective. Imagine you are watching a movie. You see the story unfold, scene by scene. So you ask, what is the first scene? That's a reasonable question. But now imagine you look deeper. You realize the movie is stored as digital data. All frames exist at once. There is no first in the file itself. Only when it is played does a beginning appear. Now here's the twist. Science is trying to find the first frame. Buddhism is pointing at the screen and saying you're looking at the wrong layer. The beginning you're searching for may not exist at the level you're asking. Now let's bring this closer to your life. Think about your own story. It feels like it has a beginning. Your birth. But is that really the beginning? Before you, there were your parents. Before them, their parents. Before that, a long chain of events. Genetics, evolution, stars forming elements. So where exactly does you begin? There is no clean answer, only a network of conditions stretching backward. Now apply that to the universe. Instead of a single starting point, you may be looking at an infinite web. No clear beginning, only interdependence. Now here comes the deeper shift. Both science and Buddhism are challenging something very basic. Your intuition. Your mind wants a clear story, a first moment, a cause. But reality may not work that way. Now let's make this even simpler. Imagine asking, what caused a circle to start? A circle has no beginning. Every point connects. No matter where you start, it's arbitrary. Buddhism suggests reality may be more like a circle than a straight line. Science, surprisingly, is beginning to consider similar ideas. Not necessarily a literal loop, but something without a clear starting edge. Now here comes the playful part. Let's compare both views directly. Science says the universe expanded from a hot, dense state. Buddhism says the universe arises from conditions. Science asks, what happened at time zero? Buddhism replies, time itself is part of the conditions. Science looks for a first event. Buddhism points to an ongoing process. Now here's where they quietly agree. Both reject a simple, human-like beginning. Both suggest that reality is deeper than our usual way of thinking. But they diverge in how they explain it. Science builds models, tests predictions. Buddhism observes experience, examines suffering. One looks outward, the other looks inward. And yet, both end up questioning the same thing. Is there really a first moment? Now let's go one step further. Let's challenge the question itself. What happened before time began? That assumes time is like a line and we can go further back. But what if time is not a line? What if it's something that emerges only under certain conditions, like a shadow? A shadow doesn't exist on its own. It appears when light and object meet. Remove either one and the shadow disappears. So asking, what is the shadow before light, doesn't make sense. Now replace shadow with time. What is time? Without change? Without events? Without differences? It may not exist at all. And that is where both science and Buddhism start to overlap. Now pause, because this is the real hook of our journey. We are not just asking, where did the universe come from? We are asking, what kind of reality doesn't need a beginning to exist? And even more personally, what kind of mind needs one? Because maybe the need for a beginning is not in the universe, but in us, our way of thinking, our need for stories. Now, take a slow breath, because from this point forward, things will get stranger. We will explore how time might be constructed instead of flowing, why cause and effect may not work the way you think, and how a 2,500-year-old teaching and modern physics unexpectedly meet in the same place. But for now, just stay with the question, not trying to answer it, just feeling it. What if the universe never truly began? And what if that's not a problem, but the clue? Part 2. The universe doesn't start, your thinking does. Now let's take one step deeper. In part 1, we left you with a strange tension. Science says time begins with the universe. Early Buddhism says there is no true beginning. At first glance, they sound like they disagree. But here's the twist. What if both are correct, but answering two completely different questions? Let's slow this down. Science is asking, what happens if we go backward in time? Buddhism is asking, does going backward even make sense? Those are not the same question. And once you see that, something subtle shifts. Now imagine this. You open Google Maps, you zoom into a city. You can scroll north, south, east, west. Every location exists on the map. Now ask yourself, where does the map begin? You might point to the top edge, but that's not really the beginning. It's just the limit of your screen. Now zoom out. There is no edge, no starting point, just a system of coordinates. Now here's the key. Science is zooming in, looking for the edge. Buddhism is zooming out, saying, there was never an edge to begin with. Now let's bring science back into focus. The Big Bang. Most people imagine it like an explosion, a point in space where everything burst outward. But that picture is wrong. It wasn't an explosion in space. It was the expansion of space itself. There was no center, no outside, and most importantly, no time before it, because time was part of the system that expanded. So when science says time began at the Big Bang, what it really means is our model of time stops working before this point. That's very different from saying nothing existed before. Now here comes the first mind flip. Science does not actually prove that the universe had a beginning. It only shows that our current understanding has a limit, and beyond that limit, we don't know. Now enter early Buddhism. Instead of asking, what happened before the beginning? It asks, what conditions create what you call a beginning? This is where the concept of dependent origination becomes powerful. Everything arises because of conditions. Not one cause, but a chain, a network. No first domino, just dominoes already falling. Now here's a simple way to feel this. Imagine a line of dominoes. You see them falling. So you ask, which domino started it? You walk backward. There's another, and another, and another. Eventually, you stop. Not because you found the first domino, but because you ran out of patience. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. The universe might be like that. Not a single starting point, but a chain with no clear beginning. Now science starts to whisper something similar. Some models suggest the Big Bang might not be the beginning. It could be a transition from another state, a previous phase, a different condition. So instead of something from nothing, we may be looking at something from something else we don't yet understand. Now here's where the two perspectives meet. Science says we hit a boundary. Buddhism says that boundary is your illusion. Science says time begins here. Buddhism says time itself is part of the illusion of sequence. Now let's make this very simple. Think about a wave in the ocean. You look at a wave and you ask, where did this wave begin? It feels like a valid question. But the wave is not separate from the ocean. It is just a pattern, a temporary shape. There is no first wave, only movement. Now apply that to the universe. Science is studying the wave, measuring its height, its speed, its origin point. Buddhism is pointing at the ocean, saying the wave is not separate. Now here comes the deeper shift. The idea of a beginning may come from how your mind works. Your brain thinks in sequences, before, after, cause, effect. It builds stories, but reality may not be a story. It may be a system. Now let's challenge something even more basic. Cause and effect. We assume every effect must have a cause, so naturally we ask what caused the universe. But here's the problem. Cause and effect only exist in time. You need a before and an after. But if time itself begins with the universe, then cause and effect cannot exist before it. So asking, what caused the universe, may be like asking, what is before? Now Buddhism steps in again. It doesn't rely on a first cause. Instead, it describes a loop of conditions. Ignorance leads to formations. Formations lead to consciousness. Consciousness leads to form. A cycle, not a line. Now here's the interesting part. Modern science is also exploring nonlinear models. Not a single beginning, but cyclic universes, bouncing cosmologies, quantum fluctuations, different language, same discomfort. The universe may not fit into a simple timeline. Now let's bring in a relatable example. Think about your sleep. When exactly does sleep begin? Is it the moment you close your eyes? Or when your brain waves change? Or when you stop thinking? There is no sharp boundary, only a transition. Now imagine applying that to the universe. What we call the beginning may just be a transition between states, not a true start. Now here comes the playful twist. Science is like someone trying to find the exact second you fell asleep. Buddhism is like someone saying, sleep is not a moment, it's a process. Both are observing the same thing, but from different angles. Now let's sharpen the comparison. Science focuses on external reality, measurement models. Buddhism focuses on experience, perception, suffering. Science asks, what is the universe made of? Buddhism asks, why do you experience it the way you do? Science wants a timeline. Buddhism dissolves the need for one. And here's the surprising overlap. Both suggest that reality is not as simple as our intuition. Now we return to the central question. What happened before time began? Science answers that question may not apply. Buddhism answers the idea of before may not be real. Different words, same direction. Now let's take one final step for this part. What if the real mystery is not what came before time, but why do we need there to be a before? Why does your mind refuse to accept a universe without a starting point? Because without a beginning, there is no clear story. And without a story, there is discomfort, uncertainty. But reality may not care about your need for stories. Now just sit with that, because in the next part, we're going to go even deeper. Not just questioning the beginning, but questioning time itself. Not as something that exists, but as something that might be constructed. And once you see that, you may realize something quietly shocking. The universe didn't just challenge your understanding. It challenged the way your mind is built to understand anything at all. Part 3. Time is not flowing, it is being constructed. Now, we take the next step, not asking where time began, but asking something more unsettling. What if time doesn't actually flow at all? What if it only feels like it does? Let's begin with something very ordinary, a video. You press play, you see motion, people moving, objects changing. It feels continuous, but you already know the truth. A video is not motion. It is a sequence of still images, frame by frame by frame, and your brain stitches those frames together into the illusion of movement. Now here comes the shift. What if reality works the same way? What if time is not something that flows, but something that is assembled moment by moment? Science doesn't fully confirm this, but it hints at it. At the deepest level of physics, things are not smooth. Energy comes in packets. Light behaves like particles. Even space itself may have a smallest possible unit. So naturally, scientists ask, what about time? Is there a smallest unit of time? A frame rate of the universe? There is a concept called Planck time, an incredibly tiny interval, so small that below it, our physics stops making sense. Now here's the uncomfortable idea. If time has a smallest unit, then between those units, there is no in-between, no smooth transition, just update, update, update. Now pause, because this leads to something quietly shocking. If time is discrete, then the feeling of flow is not coming from reality itself. It is coming from how your mind connects the pieces. Now, let's bring Buddhism into this. In early Buddhist thought, there is a concept that sounds surprisingly similar. Everything is impermanent. Everything is constantly arising and passing away. Not slowly, but moment by moment, extremely fast. So fast that it appears continuous. Now here's the connection. Science says reality may update in tiny steps. Buddhism says experience arises in tiny moments. Both are pointing at the same possibility. Continuity might be an illusion. Now let's make this easier to feel. Think about a spinning fan. When it spins fast enough, you don't see the blades. You see a smooth circle, but the blades are still separate. Your perception is smoothing them out. Now apply that to time. What you experience as a smooth flow may be your mind, smoothing out discrete moments. Now here comes the deeper layer. Even if time is built from moments, that still doesn't explain something important. Why does it feel like time moves forward? Why not backward? Why not randomly? This is where science introduces entropy. But let's keep it simple. Imagine dropping a glass. It shatters. Pieces scatter everywhere. Now ask yourself, why don't the pieces jump back together? Because there are far more ways for the glass to be broken than for it to be whole. So systems naturally move from order to disorder. Now here's the key. This direction creates what we call the arrow of time. Not because time itself is pushing forward, but because change is more likely in one direction. Now, Buddhism approaches this differently. It doesn't talk about entropy, but it observes something similar. Everything is in constant change. Nothing stays the same. And clinging to stability creates suffering. Now, here's the interesting overlap. Science describes the direction of change. Buddhism describes the experience of that change. Two different lenses, same underlying pattern. Now let's flip the perspective again. What if time is not what creates change, but what we call change creates time? That sounds subtle, but it changes everything. Instead of time passes, so things change, it becomes things change, so we perceive time. Now think about this. If nothing changed, would time exist? Imagine a universe completely frozen. No motion, no difference, no events. Would there be time? There would be no way to measure it, no clocks, no processes. From the inside, it would feel like nothing at all. Now, Buddhism has been pointing at this for a long time. Time is tied to experience, to change, to perception, not something independent. Now here comes the deeper twist. If time depends on change, and change depends on perception, then time, as you experience it, may not exist without you. Not entirely. Part of it is physical, but part of it is constructed. Now let's make this very real. Have you ever noticed how time feels different depending on what you're doing? When you're bored, a minute feels like forever. When you're engaged, hours disappear. But the clock doesn't change. Only your perception does, which means there are two kinds of time. Physical time, experience time, and they don't always match. Science studies the first. Buddhism explores the second. Now here comes the surprising connection. Both suggest that time is not absolute, not fixed, not as solid as it feels. Now let's return to the main question. What happened before time began? If time is constructed, then that question starts to dissolve, because without time, there is no before. Now, Buddhism would go further. It would say the idea of before is part of the illusion. Science would say the concept breaks down at extreme conditions, different language, same direction. Now let's bring in one final example. Think about a song. All the notes exist as a structure, but you don't hear them all at once. You hear them in sequence, and that sequence creates melody, emotion, experience. Now imagine hearing all notes at once. There would be no music, just noise. Now apply that to reality. The universe may be a complete structure, and time is how that structure is experienced, moment by moment. Now, here comes the quiet realization. Time may not be something the universe has. It may be something that appears when reality is experienced in sequence. Now we return again to our core exploration. Science is asking, how does time behave? Buddhism is asking, why do we experience it this way? And somewhere in between, a new question emerges. Not, when did time begin? But, what makes time appear at all? Stay with that, because in the next part, we're going even deeper, not just into time, but into something more fundamental. What reality might be made of if it's not time, not space, and not even matter in the way we usually think. And once you see that, the question changes again. Not what came before time, but what must exist for time to appear in the first place. Part 4. The universe may not be made of things. Now we go deeper. In the last part, we loosen something very fundamental. Time may not be flowing. It may be constructed. Now we take the next step. If time is not fundamental, then what is? What is reality made of, if not time, not space, not even matter, in the way we usually think? Let's start with something simple. Touch the table near you. It feels solid, stable, real. But science tells us that solidity is an illusion. At the atomic level, that table is mostly empty space. Tiny particles, vibrating, moving, held together by forces. So what you feel is not solid stuff. It is interaction. Now go deeper. Particles themselves are not tiny balls. They are excitations, disturbances in underlying fields, like ripples on the surface of water. Now pause, because this is the first crack. Reality is not made of things. It is made of patterns. Now Buddhism arrives from a completely different direction and says something surprisingly similar. There is no permanent self, no fixed entity, only processes, only changing conditions. Now connect the two. Science says no solid objects, only dynamic patterns. Buddhism says no permanent identity, only changing processes, different language, same direction. Now let's take it one step further. If reality is patterns, then what defines those patterns? Information. Not information like words or data, but relationships, structure, the way things are arranged. Now here comes the shift. What if the universe is not made of matter, but made of information? This is not just philosophy. Modern physics is starting to consider this seriously. At the deepest level, reality behaves less like stuff and more like a system of rules. Now let's make this simple. Think about a video game. On the screen, you see characters, worlds, movement, but underneath, there is no physical world. There is only code, rules. The world appears because the system updates. Now here comes the uncomfortable idea. What if the universe works in a similar way? Not necessarily a simulation, but a system where structure comes first and things come later. Now Buddhism again approaches from another angle. It does not talk about code, but it does say everything arises from conditions, no independent existence, only relationships. Now notice the overlap. Science, reality equals information structures. Buddhism, reality equals dependent conditions. Both are rejecting the idea of independent, solid things. Now let's connect this back to time. If reality is information, then time may be how information changes. Not a background, not a stage, but a consequence. Now imagine a computer. Inside, everything is static at any given moment. But when the system updates, you see motion, you see time. Now apply that to the universe. Each moment could be a configuration of information, and time is the sequence of changes between configurations. Now pause, because this changes the entire question. Instead of asking what existed before time, we ask what structure allows time to appear. Now Buddhism offers something subtle here. It describes existence as a chain of dependent arising. Ignorance leads to formations. Formations lead to consciousness. A loop. Not a substance, not a fixed system, but a process. Now here comes the deeper twist. If everything is a process, then there is no need for a beginning. Processes don't need a starting point. They only need conditions. Now let's bring in a relatable example. Think about a whirlpool in a river. You see it spinning. It feels like a thing, but it's not. It's just water moving in a pattern. There is no start to the whirlpool. It appears when conditions are right and disappears when they change. Now apply that to the universe. What we call the universe may be a pattern, not a thing, not something that was created, but something that appears when conditions align. Now science is starting to explore similar ideas, not a fixed universe, but a dynamic system, emerging from deeper rules. Now here comes the uncomfortable part. If reality is information and patterns, then what you experience as solid existence is only a layer, a projection, a way of interpreting deeper structure. Now Buddhism would say something even more radical. Your sense of self is also a pattern, not a fixed entity. Now pause, because this is where everything connects. Time, self, reality, all may be constructed from underlying processes, not fixed, not absolute. Now let's return to our central theme. Science is asking, what is reality made of? Buddhism is asking, how does experience arise? And both are pointing towards something deeper. Reality may not be made of things. It may be made of relationships. Now here comes the final shift for this part. If reality is information and time is how information changes, then the beginning of time is not a moment. It is a transition. The moment when structure becomes dynamic. Now think about freezing water. At a certain point, it becomes ice. Not suddenly, but through a transition. Now imagine the reverse, a frozen state, becoming dynamic. That might be what we call the birth of time. Not a start, but a change in behavior. Now Buddhism would phrase it differently. Not time begins, but conditions shift. And with that shift, experience appears. Now we arrive at a deeper question. If reality is structure, if time is constructed, if everything arises from conditions, then what determines those conditions? Why this universe? Why this structure? Why this experience? We don't have the answer yet, but we are getting closer to the shape of it. Because in the next part, we move into something even more unsettling. Not just what reality is made of, but whether reality itself needs to exist at all. Because if nothing is impossible, then something must exist. And if something must exist, then the origin of the universe may not be a mystery of creation, but a necessity. So the question shifts again. Not, where did everything come from? But why is there anything at all for time to emerge from? Part 5. Nothing may be impossible. Now, We arrive at a question that sounds simple, but may be the most difficult of all. What is nothing? Not empty space, not darkness, not silence, because all of those are still something. Empty space still has structure. Darkness is the absence of light. Silence is the absence of sound. But true nothing means no space, no time, no energy, no laws, no structure, no possibility. Now pause, because the moment you try to imagine that, something strange happens. Your mind fails. You always end up imagining a black void, an empty space. But that's not nothing. That's still a stage. True nothing has no stage at all. And here's where things begin to shift. In science, nothing is not what we think it is. Even the emptiest vacuum is not truly empty. It is full of activity, tiny fluctuations, particles appearing and disappearing in incredibly short times, like bubbles forming and vanishing in boiling water. Now here's the key idea. Even when you remove everything, something remains. Not matter, but potential, the possibility for something to exist. Now here comes the first twist. If nothing always contains potential, then true nothing may not exist at all. Let that sink in, because it flips a very deep assumption. We tend to think nothing is the default, that the universe somehow came from nothing. But what if the opposite is true? What if something is the default, and nothing is impossible? Now science begins to explore this idea. Some theories suggest that universes can emerge from quantum fluctuations, not from absolute nothing, but from a kind of almost nothing. A state with no particles, but still governed by laws. And within that state, tiny fluctuations can grow, expand, become a universe. Now pause, because this is where things become uncomfortable. This means the universe may not need a cause in the way we usually think. It may be a natural consequence of underlying rules, not created, not designed, but inevitable. Now, Buddhism approaches this from a very different direction. It does not talk about quantum fields, but it does say something equally radical. There is no independent origin. Everything arises from conditions, and those conditions have no beginning. Now, here's the subtle connection. Science says the universe may emerge from fluctuations. Buddhism says the universe emerges from conditions. Both reject a single moment of creation. Both suggest that existence does not require a beginning. Now let's bring in a simple example. Think about fire. You light a candle. A flame appears. Now ask, where did the flame come from? Did it exist before? Not exactly. But the conditions for it did. Fuel, oxygen, heat. When those conditions meet, flame appears. Remove them and it disappears. Now apply that to the universe. Instead of asking, where did it come from? We ask, what conditions allow it to appear? Now here comes the deeper shift. The universe may not be a thing. It may be an event, a process, like the flame. Now science is beginning to see this, not a static universe, but something dynamic, something that evolves and may arise naturally from underlying principles. Now Buddhism adds another layer. It says, clinging to the idea of a fixed origin creates confusion. Because reality is not fixed. It is constantly changing. Now here comes the uncomfortable part. If nothing cannot exist and something must exist, then the question changes. Not, why is there something instead of nothing? But how could there ever be nothing at all? Now, let's take a step deeper. Some physicists propose that all possible structures may exist, every consistent set of rules, every possible configuration, not necessarily in time, but as part of a larger reality, and our universe is just one of them. Now pause, because this removes something very familiar. The idea that our universe is special. Instead, it may simply be one possibility that is stable enough to exist. Now, Buddhism would approach this differently. It doesn't talk about multiple universes, but it does say reality is shaped by conditions and perception. Different conditions, different experiences. Now here's the overlap. Science, many possible structures. Buddhism, many possible experiences. Both suggest that what we see is not the only possibility. Now let's connect this back to time. If the universe emerges from conditions or fluctuations, then time emerges with it, not before. So again, there is no before time, only a transition from timeless potential to dynamic reality. Now here comes the deeper realization. If nothing cannot exist, then existence is not a mystery. It is a necessity. Something must exist, not because it was created, but because the alternative is impossible. Now pause, because this is where everything starts to shift. The origin of the universe may not be about creation. It may be about inevitability. Now let's return to our two perspectives. Science is asking, what are the laws that allow existence? Buddhism is asking, what are the conditions that shape experience? Both are moving toward the same idea. Reality is not a single event. It is a continuous unfolding. Now let's bring it back to you. Right now, you exist. Your thoughts arise, your awareness shifts, moments appear and disappear. Now ask yourself, where does a thought come from? Does it appear from nothing or from conditions, memory, experience, stimulus? Now you see the pattern. The same logic applies at every scale, from thoughts to the universe itself. Now here comes the final shift for this part. If existence is inevitable and time emerges from change and reality is a process, then the beginning of time is not a mystery of origin. It is a natural consequence, the moment when conditions allow change to appear. And with change comes time. Now sit with that, because in the next part, we move into something even more unsettling. Not just that time emerges, but that your experience of time may be deeply tied to how your mind works. Not just the universe, but you. Because the final layer of this question is not out there, it is in here. And once you see it, the question changes one last time. Not what happened before time, but what kind of mind needs time to make sense of reality at all? Part 6. Time may not be outside you, it may be inside you. Now we turn inward. Up to this point, we've been exploring time as if it exists out there, in the universe, in physics, in equations. But there is something we haven't questioned yet, the most obvious thing of all. You experience time, not as an equation, but as a feeling, a flow, a presence, a sense that now is moving. So here's the next question. If time is constructed, if it emerges, if it depends on change, then what creates your experience of time? Let's begin with something simple. Right now, you feel like you are in the present moment. But here's something strange. Your brain is always slightly behind reality. Light hits your eyes, signals travel through neurons, your brain processes the information. By the time you become aware of something, it has already happened. And yet, you don't feel delayed. You feel like you are right here, right now. So what is happening? Your brain is not just receiving information, it is predicting, constantly. It guesses what is about to happen and compares that guess with incoming signals. So your experience of now is not a single moment, it is a construction, a blend of recent past and expected future. Now pause, because this is where things begin to shift. The present moment is not a sharp point in time, it is a window, a process. Now let's make this easier to feel. Imagine watching a live stream with a slight delay. You are always a few seconds behind, but the system smooths it out, so it feels continuous. Your brain works in a similar way. It smooths reality, it builds continuity, it creates the feeling that time is flowing. Now here comes the first deep connection. Science says time may not be fundamental. Buddhism says your experience is constructed. Now bring them together. What if the flow of time is not just a property of the universe, but also a property of your mind? Now let's go deeper. Your sense of time depends on memory. Without memory, there is no past. Without anticipation, there is no future. So what remains? Just a single moment. Now imagine this. If you had no memory, would time exist for you? There would be no story, no continuity, no sense of movement, just an eternal present. Now Buddhism has been pointing to this for thousands of years. The sense of self and the sense of time are closely linked. Both are constructed, both depend on memory, both depend on continuity. Now here comes the unsettling idea. What if your sense of being you is built the same way as your sense of time? Not a continuous entity, but a sequence, moment by moment by moment. Now think about a movie again. Each frame is separate, but together they create a character, a story, an identity. Now apply that to yourself. Your thoughts, your feelings, your memories are like frames, and your brain stitches them together into a sense of self. And time is the structure that holds that story together. Now pause, because this is where science and Buddhism quietly meet again. Science studies how the brain constructs experience. Buddhism observes that experience is not fixed. Both suggest what feels continuous may be assembled. Now let's push this further. If your experience of time is constructed, then it can change, and it does. When you are bored, time slows down. When you are engaged, time speeds up. When you are afraid, time stretches. Moments feel longer, sharper, but the clock doesn't change. Only your perception does. So which one is real? Now here comes the deeper insight. There may not be a single real time. There is physical time and experience time, and they don't always match. Science focuses on the first. Buddhism explores the second. Now here comes the twist. Your life is not lived in physical time. It is lived in experience time, which means the time that matters most to you is the one your mind creates. Now pause again, because this changes something fundamental. The question is no longer, what is time? But, how is time experienced? Now let's return to our main theme. What happened before time began? If time is partly constructed, then that question becomes even more fragile. Because without a mind, without memory, without perception, the idea of before may not exist at all. Now, Buddhism would say, time is part of the illusion of continuity. Science would say, time depends on processes and observers. Different language, same direction. Now here comes the final shift for this part. If time is constructed and your experience depends on it, then your reality is not just what exists, it is how it is experienced. Now think about this. Two people in the same moment can experience completely different times. One feels it dragging, the other feels it flying. Same clock, different realities. Now extend that idea. If perception shapes time, then the universe you experience is not just the universe itself. It is the universe filtered through your mind. Now we arrive at a very quiet question. If time is constructed and experience is constructed, then what is underneath both? What is the thing that experiences? We don't answer that yet, but we move closer, because in the next part, we step into something even more unsettling. Not just how time is experienced, but whether the distinction between past, present, and future is real at all. Because if all moments exist, then time may not be moving. You may be. And once you see that, the question changes again. Not, what happened before time? But why are you experiencing this moment instead of any other? Part 7. The past, present, and future may all exist at once. Now we step into one of the most unsettling ideas of all. Not about where time begins, not about how it flows, but whether it flows at all. Because what if the past, the present, and the future all exist at the same time? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but physically. Let's slow this down. Right now, you feel like you are moving through time, from yesterday to today to tomorrow. It feels obvious, natural. But what if that feeling is not because time is moving, but because you are? Now imagine this. Think of reality not as something unfolding, but as something already complete. A vast structure, every event, every moment, every possible experience, all laid out like a landscape. Now imagine your consciousness as a point moving through that landscape. You don't see everything at once. You only see the slice you are currently passing through. And that slice feels like now. Now pause, because this is where intuition starts to resist. It feels wrong, because you feel time passing. But let's test that feeling. Think about a memory, a moment from your past. Where does it exist? Not out there, only as information inside you. Now think about the future. Where does that exist? As expectation, prediction. Now here comes the shift. What if both past and future exist in the same structure, but you only have access to certain parts of it? Now science calls this idea the block universe. In this view, time is not flowing. All moments exist equally. There is no special now, no universal present, just a structure. Now here comes the first deep discomfort. If all moments exist, then the future is not something that hasn't happened yet. It is something you haven't experienced yet. Let that settle, because it changes everything. Now Buddhism approaches this differently. It does not describe a block universe, but it does say something equally unsettling. The distinction between past, present, and future is constructed. It arises from perception, from memory, from how the mind processes experience. Now here's the connection. Science says all moments may exist. Buddhism says the sense of time is constructed. Together, they point to something radical. Time may not be something that moves. It may be something that is experienced. Now let's make this easier to feel. Imagine a book. Every page already exists. The beginning, the middle, the end, all printed, all fixed. But when you read the book, you experience it one page at a time. You feel like this was unfolding, but in reality, it is already there. Now here comes the twist. What if the universe is like that book, and your consciousness is what reads it? Now pause, because this leads to a difficult question. If all moments exist, why are you here in this moment instead of another? Why this page of the book? We don't answer that yet, but we move closer. Now let's explore something subtle. Why does the past feel fixed and the future feel open? Because your brain contains records of the past, memories, but it does not contain records of the future. So from your perspective, the past feels real, the future feels uncertain, but in the structure itself, both may exist equally. Now, here comes the second shift. The difference between past and future may not be in reality. It may be in information, what you have access to and what you don't. Now let's bring Buddhism back in. It observes that experience is shaped by perception. What you remember feels real. What you imagine feels uncertain, but both arise in the mind. Now connect that to the block universe idea. Your now is simply the part of reality your mind is currently accessing. Not the only moment, just the current one. Now here comes the deeper discomfort. If all moments exist, then what about choice? What about free will? Are your decisions already part of the structure, or is there still freedom? Science does not have a clear answer. Some interpretations suggest everything is fixed. Others suggest multiple possible paths exist. Now, Buddhism approaches this differently. It does not ask whether the future is fixed. It asks, how do your actions shape your experience? This is where karma comes in, not as fate, but as a chain of cause and effect. Your actions influence your future experience, not as a fixed destiny, but as conditions. Now, here's the connection. Science explores possible paths. Buddhism explores how conditions shape those paths. Both acknowledge that the future is not simple. Now let's bring this back to something personal. Right now, you feel like you are moving through time. But what if you are not moving through time, but moving through a structure that already exists? Now sit with that, because it changes the question again. Not what happened before time, but what determines your path through time. Now here comes the final shift for this part. If all moments exist and your experience is a path, then the beginning of time is not a universal event. It is simply the point where your path begins. Beyond that, there may be other regions of reality, not before, but inaccessible. Now pause, because this is where everything becomes quiet. The universe may not have a beginning, time may not flow, reality may not unfold, and yet you experience movement, you experience change, you experience time. So the question becomes sharper. Not what is time, but what is experiencing it. And that is where we go next. Because in the next part, we move into something even deeper. Not just the structure of reality, but the nature of the observer itself. Because if time is not fundamental, then the one who experiences time may be the key to understanding everything. Part 8. The observer may be the missing piece. Now we arrive at something even more subtle. Up to this point, we have been questioning everything. Time may not flow. The universe may not have a beginning. Reality may not be made of solid things, and even your experience may be constructed. But there is one thing we haven't fully examined yet. The one who is experiencing all of this, you. Now here's the question. If time is not fundamental, then what is it? That experiences time? Let's begin gently. Right now, you are aware. You are hearing these words. Thoughts may arise, images, feelings, all of that appears in your awareness. Now ask yourself something very simple. Where does this awareness exist? Is it in your brain? Science would say consciousness is produced by brain activity, neurons firing, signals processing, a complex system giving rise to experience. But here's the strange part. Even if we map every neuron, every signal, we still don't fully explain why there is experience at all. Why does activity feel like something? Why is there an inner world? This is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Now, Buddhism approaches this differently. It does not ask, where does consciousness come from? It asks, what is the nature of experience? And what it finds is something surprising. There is no fixed observer, no permanent self, only a stream of experiences. Thoughts, sensations, perceptions, all arising and passing away. Now pause, because this is where things begin to dissolve. You feel like there's a you watching everything. But when you look closely, that you is not a single thing. It is also a process. Now connect this back to time. If the self is a process and time is a process, then your experience of moving through time may not involve a fixed observer at all. Now let's make this easier to feel. Imagine a river. Water flows. You see movement. Now imagine placing a leaf on the surface. The leaf moves with the flow. Now here's the twist. What if the leaf is not separate from the river? What if it is part of the same process? Now apply that to yourself. You feel like the observer moving through time. But what if you are part of the same process that creates time? Not separate, not outside, but within it. Now science starts to touch this idea in a different way. In physics, the observer plays a role. Not necessarily as a human, but as a system that interacts and extracts information. Reality is not just there, it is what can be observed, measured. Now here comes the subtle connection. Science suggests observation matters. Buddhism suggests experience is everything. Both point to the same tension. Reality cannot be fully separated from the observer. Now here comes the deeper question. If there is no fixed self, then who is experiencing time? And if there is no fixed observer, then what is moving through the moments? Now let's approach this slowly. Think about your thoughts. They appear, they disappear. You don't control most of them. They arise on their own. Now ask, are you the thinker or the observer of thoughts? And then ask, is there even a clear difference? Now pause, because this is where the sense of self begins to loosen. You may start to notice something. Experience is happening, but the owner of that experience is not clearly defined. Now Buddhism goes further. It suggests that the sense of self is constructed from 5 components: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, consciousness. Together, they create the illusion of a person, but none of them is a fixed self. Now connect this to time again. Your sense of being in time depends on memory, on continuity, on the idea that there is a you moving forward. But if that you is also constructed, then the feeling of moving through time may be constructed as well. Now here comes the unsettling insight. There may be no fixed observer moving through time, only experience unfolding, moment by moment. Now let's bring science back in. Some theories suggest that consciousness itself may not be fundamental. It may emerge from complex systems, just like time, just like matter. Now notice the pattern. Time, self-reality, all may be emergent, not fundamental. Now here comes the deeper shift. If both the observer and time are constructed, then the relationship between them is also constructed. Which means the question, what happened before time, may not just be about the universe. It may be about how the mind frames reality. Now let's make this very simple. Imagine wearing a pair of glasses. The lenses tint everything blue. You look at the world and think, everything is blue. But the color is coming from the lens. Now what if time is part of that lens? Not something out there, but something shaping how you see. Now Buddhism would say, remove the lens and you see differently. Not outside time entirely, but without clinging to it, without constructing a rigid story. Now here comes the final shift for this part. If the observer is not fixed and time is not fixed, then reality may not be a story with a beginning and an end. It may be something else entirely, a field of experience, arising, passing, without a clear center, without a clear start. Now sit with that, because in the next part we move into something even deeper, not just the observer, but the nature of reality, when both observer and time are no longer fixed. Because once both dissolve, a new question appears. Not what happened before time, but what remains, when both time and the observer are seen as processes. Part 9. When both time and self dissolve. Now we arrive at a very quiet edge. In the last part, we loosen something deeply familiar. The idea that there is a fixed you moving through time. And before that, we question time itself, not as something that flows, but something that may be constructed. So now we stand in a strange place. If time is not fixed and the observer is not fixed, then what remains? Let's not rush. Let's approach this slowly. Right now, experience is happening. You are aware. There are sensations, sounds, thoughts, all of it appearing. Now remove something. Remove the idea of past, no memory. Remove the idea of future, no anticipation. What remains? Just this. A single field of experience, no timeline, no movement, just presence. Now here's the subtle shift. Without memory, there is no past. Without projection, there is no future. Without both, There is no time, and yet experience still exists. Now pause, because this is where something unexpected appears. Experience does not require time, it only requires awareness. Now, science doesn't usually phrase it this way, but it does acknowledge something similar. All observations, all measurements, all experiences happen in the present. There is no direct access to the past or future, only records, only predictions. Now, Buddhism goes further. It invites you to observe directly, not concepts, but experience itself. And when you do, you may notice something. The present moment is not a point. It is not a thin slice. It has depth. It contains sensation, memory traces, anticipation, all blended together. Now here comes the deeper realization. What you call time is how the mind organizes experience, not something separate from it. Now let's bring back a simple example. Imagine listening to music. A melody unfolds over time, but at any given moment, you are not hearing just one note. You are holding the previous notes in memory while anticipating the next. That overlap creates the feeling of continuity. Now imagine removing memory. Each note would stand alone, no melody, no sense of progression. Now apply that to reality. Without memory, experience would not feel like a flow. It would feel like isolated moments. Now here's the twist. Those isolated moments may be closer to how reality actually is. And the flow is something your mind constructs. Now Buddhism describes something similar. It speaks of momentariness, experience arising and passing away in rapid succession, so fast that it appears continuous. Now connect this back to science. We already explored the possibility that time is made of discrete units, tiny frames of reality. Now bring the two together. Science suggests time may be discrete. Buddhism suggests experience is momentary. Together, they point toward a shared insight. Continuity may be an illusion. Now pause, because this is where things become very quiet. If both time and self are constructed, then what you experience as reality is not a fixed story. It is a dynamic process. Now let's take this one step further. If there is no fixed self, then who is experiencing this moment? Not as a concept, but directly. Look at your experience. There is awareness. But can you find its center, a boundary, a fixed point where you are located? Or is there just experience happening? Now don't try to answer quickly. Just notice, because this is where the illusion of self begins to soften. Now science doesn't fully describe this experience, but it does suggest that the brain constructs a model of a self, a representation, not a fixed entity. Now Buddhism has been pointing to this for a long time. The self is not something you have, it is something that appears. Now here comes the deeper shift. If the self is not fixed and time is not fixed, then reality may not have a center, no fixed observer. No fixed timeline, just process. Now let's bring this back to the origin question. What happened before time began? If time is constructed and the observer is constructed, then the question itself is built on assumptions that may not hold. There may be no before, no beginning, no first moment, only a structure and a way of experiencing it. Now here comes the final realization for this part. The mystery of the universe may not be about what existed before time. It may be about how time appears in experience and how the sense of self moves within that appearance. Now sit with that, because something subtle has changed. The question is no longer out there. It has turned inward, from the origin of the universe to the nature of experience. And in the next part, we take one final step deeper. Not just dissolving time, not just dissolving the self, but exploring what remains when both are seen as processes. Because if both fall away, what is left may be closer to reality itself. Part 10. What remains when everything falls away? Now we arrive at the quietest point in this journey. We have taken apart almost everything that once felt solid. Time may not flow. The universe may not have a true beginning. Reality may not be made of things. The self may not be a fixed entity. So now, very gently, we ask the final question. When all of that falls away, what remains? Don't answer quickly. Just stay here, because this is not a question that can be solved by thinking alone. It has to be felt. Let's begin with something simple. Right now, there is experience, sounds, sensation, perhaps the feeling of your breath, thoughts appearing and fading, all of it happening. Now remove the labels. Don't call it sound. Don't call it thought. Don't call it you. Just notice that something is happening without naming it. Now pause, because something very subtle appears. Experience is present, even without the story about it. Now, here comes the first shift. The story is optional. The experience is not. Now let's connect this back to everything we explored. Time is part of the story. Past, future, sequence, all constructed to organize experience. The self is part of the story. A center, a continuity, an identity, also constructed, but underneath both, experience remains. Now, science doesn't usually describe it this way, but it does hint at something similar. All measurements, all observations require interaction, something happening, a process, not a fixed object. Now, Buddhism goes directly to this point. It points to experience before concepts, before identity, before time. And it says this is where understanding begins. Now, here comes the deeper insight. If you remove the idea of time, experience does not disappear. If you remove the idea of self, experience does not disappear. So neither time nor self is required for experience to exist. Now pause, because this changes the entire question. The origin of the universe may not be about when something started. It may be about how experience arises. Now let's make this more tangible. Think about a dream. While you are dreaming, there is a world, events, people, time passing. It feels real. But when you wake up, you realize the entire structure was created by the mind. Time in the dream felt real, but it was not independent. Now here comes the uncomfortable idea. What if your waking experience is also constructed in ways you don't fully see? Not that it's unreal, but that the structure you perceive is shaped by how your mind processes reality. Now, Buddhism has been pointing to this for a long time, not to deny reality, but to question how it is experienced. Now let's return to the original question. What happened before time began? At this point, the question has changed. Because we've seen, time may not be fundamental, the self may not be fixed, reality may be a process. So asking about a before may no longer make sense. Now here comes the final shift. Instead of asking what came before time, we ask what allows experience to appear, even when time is not assumed. Now sit with that, because the answer is not a concept, it is something you are already inside of, right now. Now let's take one more step, very gently. Notice your awareness, not what you are aware of, but the fact that you are aware. Can you find its edge? Does it have a shape, a location, a boundary? Or is it simply open? Now don't try to define it, just notice, because this is where language starts to fall apart. Now, science cannot fully describe this. It can map brain activity. It can describe processes. But the raw fact of awareness remains difficult to reduce. Now, Buddhism approaches it differently. Not by defining it, but by observing it directly, without adding a story. Now, here comes the deepest realization of this part. When time is seen as constructed and the self is seen as constructed, what remains is not nothing. It is not empty in the sense of absence. It is empty of fixed identity. Empty of independent existence, but full of potential, of experience. Now, this is often misunderstood. Emptiness does not mean nothing exists. It means nothing exists independently. Everything depends on conditions. Now connect this back to the origin of the universe. If everything depends on conditions, then there is no need for a single beginning, no need for a first cause, only an ongoing process. Now science, in its own way, is moving towards similar ideas. Not a simple origin, but a complex system emerging from deeper rules. Now, here comes the final quiet insight. The mystery of the universe may not be solved by looking further back in time, because back in time may not exist in the way we think. Instead, the mystery shifts from when did it begin to what is this that is happening now? Now stay here, not trying to answer, just noticing. Because at this point, something subtle has happened. The question has dissolved, not because it was answered, but because the assumptions behind it no longer hold. And in that space, something quieter appears. Not a conclusion, but a different way of seeing, one that does not need a beginning or an end, only this. Part 11. The universe may not need an answer. Now, we reach a point that feels almost unsatisfying. And that is exactly why it matters, because up to now, your mind has been searching for a beginning, a cause, a clear explanation, something that feels complete. But what if the universe does not owe you that kind of answer? Let's slow this down. Think about how your mind works. When you see something, you want to understand it. When something happens, You ask why. Cause, effect, reason. Your mind is a pattern-seeking machine. It builds stories, it connects dots, it fills gaps. Now, this works beautifully for everyday life. You drop something, it falls. You touch fire, it burns. Cause and effect. But what happens when you apply that same thinking to the entire universe? You ask, what caused everything? And your mind expects an answer that fits the same pattern. A first cause, a starting point. But here's the problem. That pattern only works inside the system, inside time, inside cause and effect. But the origin of the universe may not be inside that system, so your usual tools don't apply. Now pause, because this is where something subtle happens. The question itself may be flawed, not because it's wrong, but because it assumes something that may not be true, that everything must have a cause. Now science has started to accept this. At the quantum level, events can happen without a clear cause in the classical sense. Not random in a simple way, but not strictly determined either. Now, Buddhism approaches this differently. It does not say things are uncaused, but it rejects a single ultimate cause. Instead, it describes a network of conditions. Everything depends on everything else. Now, here comes the key insight. Both perspectives are moving away from the idea of a single origin point. Science, the beginning may not be a simple event. Buddhism, there is no first cause. Now let's bring this into a simple example. Imagine asking, what is the first ripple in a pond? You throw a stone, ripples spread. But if the pond has always been moving, waves overlapping waves, there may be no clear first ripple, only interaction. Now apply that to the universe. Instead of a single beginning, you may be looking at an ongoing process with no clear start. Now here comes the uncomfortable part. Your mind doesn't like that. It wants closure. It wants a clean answer. But reality may not be clean. Now let's flip the perspective. What if the need for an answer is the problem, not the lack of one? Think about this. Why do you need a beginning? Because it makes things feel understandable, contained, finite. But what if reality is not meant to be contained in that way? Now, Buddhism goes further. It suggests that clinging to the need for answers creates suffering, because reality does not conform to those expectations. Now, science doesn't use that language, but it encounters the same limit. At the edges of knowledge, equations break down, concepts fail, and instead of answers, there are boundaries. Now here comes the deeper insight. Both science and Buddhism reach a point where explanation stops, not because there is nothing there, but because our way of asking no longer works. Now let's return to the original question. What happened before time began? At this point, you can feel something shifting. The question is losing its grip, not because it's been answered, but because it no longer fits. Now, here comes the key realization. Some questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be seen through. Now, let's make this very simple. Imagine asking, where does the circle begin? You can pick any point, but none of them is truly the beginning. The question itself assumes a starting point that doesn't exist. Now, apply that to time. If time is not a straight line, but a constructed experience or a structure, then asking for a beginning may not make sense. Now pause, because this is where something relaxes. The pressure to find an answer starts to dissolve. Now here comes the final shift for this part. The mystery of the universe may not be something to solve. It may be something to understand differently. Not by finding the first moment, but by seeing how the idea of a first moment is created. Now sit with that, because something important has changed. You are no longer chasing the origin of time as an event. You are beginning to see the structure that makes the question possible. And once you see that, the question transforms. Not, what caused the universe? But, why do we expect there to be a cause at all? And in that shift, a different kind of understanding appears. Not an answer, but clarity. A quiet recognition that reality may not need to begin in order to exist. And in the next part, we take this even further. Not by adding more explanations, but by exploring what happens when the need for explanation itself begins to fall away. Part 12. When the question disappears, something else appears. Now, we go one step further. Not by adding new ideas, but by letting something go. Up to this point, we've been slowly loosening the structure of the question. Where did the universe begin? What happened before time? At first, those questions felt solid, important, necessary. But now, something has shifted. They don't feel as sharp anymore. Not because we found a final answer, but because we've seen something deeper. The questions themselves are built on assumptions. Now let's look at those assumptions clearly. First, time exists as a real flowing thing. Second, there must be a beginning. Third, there must be a cause. And fourth, there is a you observing all of this. But we've gently examined each one. Time may be constructed. A beginning may not exist. Cause and effect may not apply universally. And the self may not be fixed. So now, what happens to the question? It starts to dissolve, not violently, not suddenly, just quietly, losing its grip. Now here comes the important part. When a question dissolves, it doesn't leave nothing behind. It leaves space, and in that space, something new can appear. Let's explore that. Right now, stop asking. Just listen. Just notice. Experience is happening. No need to explain it. No need to place it in time. No need to define a beginning. Just this. Now pause, because something very subtle is happening. Without the question, the experience feels different, less tense, less divided. Now here's the shift. The need to understand can create distance. It separates you from what is happening. But when the need relaxes, experience becomes direct, immediate. Now, Buddhism has always pointed to this, not as a belief, but as something to see directly. It doesn't say, here is the answer to the universe. It says, look at your experience. See how it arises. See how it passes. See how the mind constructs stories to explain it. Now, science approaches from a different direction. It builds models. It explains patterns. It predicts behavior. And it does this incredibly well. But even science reaches a point where explanation stops, where the question becomes, what is the nature of reality itself? And at that edge, both science and Buddhism begin to point in the same direction. Not toward more answers, but toward deeper observation. Now let's make this very simple. Imagine trying to describe the taste of water. You can talk about it. You can analyze it. But the description is not the experience. Now apply that to reality. All our explanations, all our theories are descriptions, not the thing itself. Now here comes the deeper realization. The origin of the universe may not be something you can fully describe, because description requires concepts, and concepts are part of the system we've been questioning. Now pause, because this is where something softens. The need for a final answer begins to fade, not out of frustration, but out of clarity. Now let's return one more time to the central question. What happened before time began? At this point, you can feel it. The question doesn't land the same way. It feels like asking, where does a circle begin? Or what is north of the North Pole? It's not that the answer is hidden. It's that the question doesn't fit. Now here comes the final shift for this part. Understanding the universe may not be about finding the first moment. It may be about seeing how the idea of a first moment arises. And once you see that, something changes, not in the universe, but in how you relate to it. Now sit with this. You don't need to solve the universe to experience it. You don't need a beginning to be here now. You don't need a final answer to understand something deeply. Sometimes understanding is not about adding more knowledge. It is about removing confusion. Now let everything settle. No need to think. No need to analyze. Just notice. Experience is here. Awareness is here. No beginning required. No ending required. Just this. And in the next part, we will gently return to the world of concepts again, but this time with a different perspective. Not to rebuild the illusion, but to understand how it works. So that even within time, even within the story, you can see clearly what is real and what is constructed. Part 13, living inside the illusion without being trapped by it. Now we gently return. Back into the world of time, back into the world of cause and effect, back into the world where things seem to begin and end. Because even after everything we've explored, you still live here. You still wake up. You still remember yesterday. You still plan tomorrow. So here comes the important question. If time is constructed, if the self is constructed, if reality is not what it seems, then how do you live inside it? Do you reject it? Do you ignore it? Or do you understand it in a different way? Let's begin with something simple. Imagine watching a movie. You know it's not real. You know the characters are actors. You know the story is constructed. And yet, you still feel something. You still laugh. You still feel tension. You still get pulled into it. Now here's the key. You are engaged, but not completely lost. You can step back. You can see both layers, the story and the fact that it is a story. Now pause, because this is exactly the shift. Understanding time does not mean escaping it. It means seeing it as part of the experience, not as absolute reality. Now, Buddhism describes this very clearly. It does not tell you to reject the world. It tells you to see it clearly, to recognize what is constructed, what is changing, what is not fixed. Now, science approaches this differently. It builds models. It describes reality in terms of laws and patterns. And those models work. They allow you to navigate the world. But even science knows that models are not reality itself. They are representations. Now, here's where both perspectives meet again. Both say what you experience is not the ultimate layer of reality, but it is still valid within its context. Now, let's make this very practical. You still use time. You still have schedules. You still remember the past and plan the future. That doesn't disappear, but something changes. You no longer see time as something rigid. You see it as a tool, a framework. Now here comes the deeper shift. When you believe time is absolute, you feel trapped by it. You feel, I am running out of time. I am stuck in the past. I am worried about the future. But when you see time as constructed, those thoughts begin to loosen. Not because they disappear, but because they are seen differently. Now, Buddhism points directly to this. Suffering arises when we cling to things as fixed, to identity, to time, to outcomes. But when we see that everything is changing, that everything is dependent, something relaxes. Now, science doesn't talk about suffering, but it does show that reality is not fixed, not absolute. And that insight can have the same effect. Now let's bring this back to the origin question one more time. Where did the universe begin? From the perspective of everyday life, you can still say the universe began with the Big Bang. That's a useful model. But now you also see that beginning is part of a framework, not an absolute starting point. Now, Buddhism would say there is no ultimate beginning, only conditions. Now, here's the important part. You don't need to choose one. You can understand both. Use the scientific model to describe the physical world. Use the insight of dependent origination to understand experience. Now here comes the deeper integration. Science explains how things behave. Buddhism explains how experience arises. And when you hold both together, you get something more complete. Not a final answer, but a clearer way of seeing. Now let's bring it back to you. Right now, you are experiencing this moment. Time feels real. The sense of you feels real. And in a practical sense, they are. But now you also see they are not fixed. They are processes. Now here comes the final shift for this part. Living with this understanding does not remove you from reality. It allows you to move within it with more clarity, less resistance, less confusion. Now imagine this. You are in a dream, but you know you are dreaming. You still experience the dream, but you are not fully trapped by it. Now apply that to waking life. You still experience time, but you are not completely defined by it. You still experience a sense of self, but you are not fully limited by it. Now sit with that, because something important has shifted again. The question is no longer, what is the origin of the universe? It becomes, how do I relate to reality, knowing what I now see? And that question is not abstract. It is immediate. It shapes how you experience every moment. And in the next part, we move toward the final pieces. Not to conclude the mystery, but to bring everything together. Science, Buddhism, time, self, reality. Not as separate ideas, but as parts of the same unfolding picture. And once you see that picture clearly, you may realize something unexpected. The universe was never the problem. It was always the way we were trying to understand it. Part 14, 2 paths, 1 mystery. Now we begin to bring everything together, not by simplifying it, but by seeing it clearly. 2 paths, very different on the surface, science and early Buddhism. One uses equations, the other uses direct observation. One looks outward, the other looks inward. And yet, after everything we've explored, they seem to circle around the same mystery. Not the same answers, but the same edge. Now let's slow this down. Science begins with a question. What is the universe made of? It studies matter, energy, space, time. It builds models, the Big Bang, quantum fields, space-time. And as it goes deeper, something unexpected happens. The solid world dissolves, matter becomes patterns, Time becomes flexible. The beginning becomes unclear. Now Buddhism begins from a completely different place, not the universe, but experience. It asks what is happening right now. It observes sensation, thought, perception. And as it looks deeper, something similar happens. The self dissolves, continuity dissolves, time dissolves, only processes remain. Now pause, because this is where the two paths begin to echo each other. Science says reality is not made of solid things. Buddhism says there is no fixed self. Science says time may not be fundamental. Buddhism says time is constructed in experience. Science says the beginning is unclear. Buddhism says there is no true beginning. Different language, different methods, but the same direction. Now here comes the important part. They are not the same, and it's important not to blur them together. Science relies on measurement. It tests, it verifies, it predicts. Buddhism relies on observation of experience. It investigates directly. It is not trying to describe the universe externally. It is trying to understand how experience works. Now here's the key distinction. Science answers, how does the universe behave? Buddhism explores, how does experience arise? Now let's make this very simple. Imagine looking at a wave. Science measures height, speed, energy. Buddhism observes how the wave is perceived. Both are valid, but they are not the same question. Now here comes the deeper insight. When you combine both perspectives, you begin to see something fuller, not a complete answer, but a more balanced view. Now let's return to the central theme one last time. The origin of the universe. Science says there was a hot, dense state, but before that, we don't know. Buddhism says there is no first cause, only conditions. Now here comes the subtle agreement. Both reject a simple, clean beginning. Both suggest that reality is more complex than a single starting point. Now let's bring this into a relatable analogy. Imagine trying to find the first wave in the ocean. Science studies the waves, tracks their motion, tries to trace them back. Buddhism looks at the ocean itself, saying the wave is not separate. Now here comes the shift. If the wave is not separate, then asking for the first wave misses the deeper picture. Now apply that to the universe. If everything is interconnected, then asking for a single origin may be the wrong frame. Now let's go one level deeper. Science reaches a boundary where its equations stop working. Buddhism reaches a boundary where concepts stop working. Now pause, because this is the most important overlap. Both reach a limit, not because there is nothing beyond it, but because the tools no longer apply. Now here comes the quiet realization. The mystery of the universe is not just out there. It is also in how we try to understand it. Now let's bring this back to you. You are listening. You are processing. You are trying to make sense of all this. And that process itself is part of the system. Now here comes the final shift for this part. Science and Buddhism are not competing answers. They are two ways of looking, two lenses, one external, one internal. And when you see both, you don't necessarily solve the mystery, but you understand its shape. Now sit with that. The universe may not have a clear beginning. Time may not flow. The self may not be fixed. And yet, experience continues. Now the question changes one last time. Not which view is correct, but what happens when you see through both? And in the next part, we move toward the final layer. Not to conclude the mystery, but to see what remains when all explanations, all models, all perspectives are held lightly. Because at that point, something very simple and very quiet begins to stand out. Part 15. The answer was never out there. Now, we arrive at the final turn. Not the end of the mystery, but the end of how we've been approaching it. From the very beginning, you were asked to consider something enormous, the origin of the universe. What happened before time began? Science gave you models. Buddhism gave you insight. We compared them, challenged them, turned them inside out. And somewhere along the way, something subtle happened. The question began to change. At first, it was out there, in space, in time, in the beginning of everything. But now it feels closer, almost uncomfortably close. Now here is the final shift. What if the answer was never out there to begin with? Let's slow down. Every question you asked was formed in your mind. Beginning, before, time, cause. These are not features of the universe. They are tools of thinking. They are how your mind organizes reality. Now, this is not a mistake. It's how the mind works. It creates structure. It builds order. It turns raw experience into something understandable. But here's the catch. The tools you use to understand reality also limit how you see it. Now pause, because this is the key to everything. When you ask, what happened before time, you are using a tool that depends on time to question time itself. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. Now science reaches this limit through equations. At a certain point, they stop working. Not because reality ends, but because the tools no longer apply. Now Buddhism reaches the same limit through observation. At a certain point, concepts dissolve, not because experience ends, but because the mind stops constructing. Now here comes the quiet realization. The mystery of the universe is not just a mystery of reality. It is a mystery of perception, of how we ask, of how we think. Now let's bring this back to something simple. Imagine trying to scoop water with your hands. You can hold some, but it always slips through. Not because the water is impossible, but because your method is limited. Now apply that to understanding the universe. Your mind is trying to hold reality with concepts, and it works to a point. But beyond that, something slips through. Now here comes the final insight. The origin of the universe may not be something you can fully grasp with thought alone. Not because it's hidden, but because it is not a thing that can be contained. Now, Buddhism offers a different approach, not to solve the mystery, but to see clearly, to observe experience without forcing it into a structure, without needing a beginning, without needing an end. Now science continues to explore, to refine, to expand its models, and that journey is valuable. But even science knows there are limits. Now here comes the final comparison. Science expands the map. Buddhism questions the map. Science asks, what is out there? Buddhism asks, how are you seeing it? Now pause, because this is where everything comes together. The origin of the universe and the nature of time are not just questions about reality, they are questions about how reality is experienced. And once you see that, something relaxes. You don't need to force an answer. You don't need to resolve the mystery. Now here comes the final shift. Instead of asking what happened before time, you begin to see the question itself is part of the experience. It arises, it exists, and it can also fade away. Now sit quietly with this. Right now, there is awareness. No need to define it, no need to locate it, no need to place it in time. It is simply here. Now notice something. This awareness does not need a beginning to exist. It does not need a timeline. It does not need a story. It is already complete in this moment. Now here is the final understanding. The universe may not need a beginning. Time may not need a starting point. Reality may not need a cause. And you may not need an answer to be part of it. Now let everything settle. No more searching. No more trying to resolve. Just this, experience, awareness, quietly present. And perhaps that was never the end of the journey. But the place it was always pointing to. Part 16, the mystery you don't have to solve. And now we come to the final part. Not a conclusion, not an answer, but a place to rest. From the very beginning of this journey, you were invited into a question. Where did the universe come from? What happened before time began? At first, those questions felt solid, like there must be an answer, a final explanation, something waiting just beyond our reach. But step by step, we moved differently. We didn't just chase answers. We questioned the questions. We turned them around. We looked at them from science and from early Buddhism. And something unexpected happened. The deeper we went, the less the question behaved like a problem to solve, and the more it felt like a doorway. Now let's gently revisit what we've seen. Science tells us the universe expanded from a hot, dense state. But beyond that, time itself begins to break down. There may be no before in the way we imagine. Buddhism tells us there is no first cause, only conditions giving rise to more conditions. No beginning, no absolute starting point. Now at first, these seem different, but at a deeper level, they share something profound. Both are pointing to the same edge, an edge where our usual way of thinking no longer works. Now here comes the most important realization. The question, what happened before time began? May not be a question about the universe. It may be a question about how the mind tries to understand reality. Because your mind wants a story, a beginning, a cause, a clear structure. But reality may not be structured in a way that fits those expectations. Now pause, because this is where everything softens. You don't have to force the universe into a story. You don't have to resolve every mystery. You don't have to find the first moment. Now let's bring this back to something very simple. Right now, you are here, breathing, aware, experiencing. This moment does not need a beginning to exist. It does not need a final explanation. It is already complete as it is. Now, here comes the final shift. Understanding the universe may not be about finding the ultimate answer. It may be about seeing clearly what is happening right now, without adding extra layers, without forcing a story. Now science continues its journey, exploring deeper, refining its models. And that is a beautiful process. Buddhism continues its path, observing experience, understanding the mind. And that is also a beautiful process. You don't have to choose one. You can hold both. Let science expand your understanding of the universe. Let insight refine your understanding of experience. Now sit with this for a moment. The universe may not have a clear beginning. Time may not be what it seems. The self may not be fixed. And yet, you are here, experiencing, aware. Now ask yourself, not as a problem, but as a quiet reflection. What if the mystery was never meant to be solved, but to be seen? Now let everything settle. No need to think. No need to analyze. Just notice this moment, this awareness, already here, already complete. And before we end, let's gently return to the world of action. If this journey made you pause, if it made you see something differently, or even just feel a little bit of quiet curiosity, then take a moment. Let me know. Leave a comment below. What part made you stop and think? Which idea stayed with you the longest? Do you feel science and Buddhism are closer than they seem? Because your perspective is part of this exploration too. And if you enjoy these kinds of deep, quiet journeys into science, consciousness, and the nature of reality, you can support the channel in a very simple way. Just take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might enjoy getting lost in these kinds of questions. It helps more than you think, and it allows us to keep exploring these ideas together. Until next time, rest well. And remember, you don't need to solve the universe to be part of it.